like to do a song for you now that I wrote. This is a song that I had out a few months back, and hope maybe you might.
In 2023, 15 years after one of the most humiliating moments of her career, Dolly Parton walked into the studio of Howard Stern, the same man whose show once turned her voice into a cruel joke. The microphones gleamed under cold studio lights. And for a moment, even Stern seemed unsure how to speak. The last time Dolly's name had echoed through that room, it was through a distorted recording, her audiobook twisted into vulgar mockery, her words rearranged to sound obscene. But now, the room was silent. And then came her voice. It was calm, bright, unwavering. A sound that carried not revenge, but resolution. Dolly had not come to confront the past, she had come to reclaim it. With the same grace that had once made her the sweetheart of America, she sat down, smiled, and began to talk. Not about scandal, not about anger, but about music. About a new album, Rockstar. About never letting bitterness write the final verse of her story. That quiet moment was louder than any insult ever thrown at her. It wasn't forgiveness, it was sovereignty. Long before this day, Dolly had said something that perfectly explained the paradox of her kindness. It's no fault of Elvis. He loved the song. She was talking about I Will Always Love You, the song she refused to give away even to the king of rock and roll. Elvis had wanted to record it. But his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, demanded half the publishing rights. Dolly, heartbroken but firm, said no. She knew exactly what that song meant. It was her farewell to Porter Wagoner, her mentor turned oppressor. To surrender, it would be to surrender her own freedom. I couldn't give away my soul for a contract. She later said, from Porter's possessiveness to Elvis' disappointment, from Linda Ronstadt's perfectionism to Howard Stern's cruelty, Dolly Parton's life has been a gallery of contradictions, love and betrayal, sweetness and defiance, humility and iron will. Yet through it all, she has kept smiling. Because she understands something the world often forgets. Gentleness is not weakness. It is discipline. It is survival. It is the highest form of power, the kind that doesn't have to shout to be heard. Before she became the beloved queen of country music, Dolly Rebecca Parton was just a mountain girl from Locust Ridge, Tennessee, born in a one-room cabin with no electricity, no running water, and a sky full of songs. In that wooden house perched on the Appalachian hillside, music wasn't entertainment, it was survival. With 12 children packed into a tiny space, singing was how they forgot hunger, how they prayed, and how they dreamed. Her mother, Avi Lee, taught her that every melody carried a story, and that storytelling was a kind of faith. Her father, Lee Parton, couldn't read or write, but he was clever and hardworking, a man who measured worth not by words, but by integrity. From him, Dolly learned that kindness meant nothing without discipline. By the time she was 10, the shy, sharp-eyed girl with the golden hair was already singing on local radio in Knoxville. At 18, she packed an old suitcase, kissed the Smoky Mountains goodbye, and boarded a bus to Nashville. She had no money, no contacts, but one unshakable belief that her voice was worth something. In those early years, she wrote songs for other artists, little country stories about heartbreak, mothers, and small-town songs she sold for a few dollars just to survive. But deep inside, she wanted more. She wanted to be heard, not just written. That chance came in 1967, when she was invited to join the Porter Wagoner Show, one of the most popular country programs on American television. Porter Wagoner, already a household name, saw in Dolly not just a voice, but a spark, something bright enough to reignite his show. When she appeared on stage for the first time, the audience booed. They wanted the old singer back. But Porter defended her, demanded she stay. That moment of rejection and protection intertwined became the seed of one of the most famous and complicated partnerships in country music. For years, they were a perfect duet, Porter in his rhinestone suits, Dolly with her angelic smile. Their chemistry lit up television screens across America. They recorded hit after hit, smiling as if they shared one heart and one dream. But behind the curtains, the balance began to tilt. Porter wanted control of the songs, the tours, the contracts, the money. He saw in Dolly both a muse and an investment. For a while, she tried to believe she could repay him with loyalty. He had given her a platform. She owed him gratitude. But the longer she stayed, the smaller her world became. The same man who had lifted her up was now holding her down. Dolly began to write in secret. Writing was how she breathed. Out of that suffocating silence came a song that would change her life. I Will Always Love You. It was not a love song in the romantic sense, but a farewell gentle, painful, and final. It was a way of saying, I love you, but I have to leave to survive. In 1974, she left the Porter Wagoner show. The public saw a polite goodbye, all smiles and handshakes. But privately, it was a storm. Porter sued her for $3 million, accusing her of breaking their contract and taking his profits. For a woman who had come from nothing, it was devastating. But Dolly refused to fight back publicly. She settled quietly, walked away, and never said a cruel word about him. That silence was not weakness. It was her way of protecting her dignity. And from that heartbreak came strength. Within a few years, Jolene stormed the charts, followed by I Will Always Love You, which became a timeless anthem. Decades later, Whitney Houston would sing it to the heavens, turning it into one of the most successful songs in music history. But the soul of it, the pain, the goodbye still belonged to Dolly. By the 1,980 seconds, she was no longer just a singer. She was a phenomenon. Starring in 9 to 5, she proved she could command the big screen as easily as the stage. While other stars bought mansions, Dolly built Dollywood, her own amusement park, not as a monument to herself, but as a gift to the people of her hometown. She had become a brand, but also a paradox, a woman who wore glitter like armor and smiled through every battle. She turned success into generosity, creating her imagination library to give millions of books to children around the world. And yet, behind all the sparkle, there was still tension. In Nashville, some whispered that Dolly had outgrown the country scene, that she was too big, too independent, too uncontrollable. Some resented her for smiling her way into freedom. Dolly once said, half joking, half true, in this business, they love you until you can't be owned. It was a quiet statement of rebellion, the creed of a woman who had learned to disguise her strength and sweetness. The more famous she became, the more fiercely she protected her independence. Every song, every lyric, every business decision carried the same invisible signature, mine. By then, she understood that fame could lift you up just as easily as it could consume you. That love from the crowd was fragile, but self-respect had to be permanent. And perhaps that's the real secret behind her everlasting smile. She learned that in a world built on image, control of one's own voice is the only real form of freedom. From the cabin in Locust Ridge to the stages of the Grand Ole Opry, Dolly's story wasn't about luck or charm. It was about survival, the art of remaining kind in a world that keeps testing your limits. What the world saw was a glittering woman who never said a harsh word. What they didn't see was the steel beneath the silk, a woman who could walk away from the man who made her famous. the king who wanted her song, and the industry that thought it owned her. Because even then, long before the lawsuits, the awards, and the millions, Dolly Parton already knew one simple truth. You can lose everything: money, fame, even love, but you must never lose yourself. When people talk about Dolly Parton, they often picture her as joyful, sparkling, endlessly charming, as if the spotlight itself was her natural home. But what few understand is that light can burn as easily as it illuminates. Behind the sequins and laughter, Dolly has spent her entire life learning how to survive with grace. Every smile is a kind of armor. Every joke is a gentle way of deflecting the cruelty that sometimes hides behind compliments. After leaving the Porter Wagoner show, Dolly didn't just lose a collaborator, she lost a father figure, a mentor, and the man who had once believed in her more than anyone else. That was what made his betrayal so devastating. The lawsuit he filed against her wasn't just about money. It tore through the bond she had built on gratitude and trust. During the quiet years that followed, Dolly did what she had always done. She wrote. Music became her only language of truth. Songs like Coat of Many Colors, Light of a Clear Blue Morning, and Me and Little Andy were emotional confessions disguised as melodies, the diary of a woman who appeared strong but never stopped feeling pain. When Elvis Presley expressed interest in recording I Will Always Love You, Dolly was deeply moved. Elvis was an idol, the embodiment of the American dream she had grown up admiring. But when his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, demanded half of the publishing rights, she saw what that dream really cost. If I said yes, she later recalled, it'd be selling a piece of my soul. So she said no gently, respectfully, but firmly. Elvis never recorded the song, and Dolly admitted the rejection broke her heart. Yet she also knew it was a test, the moment she had to decide whether her voice belonged to her or to the industry that wanted to own it. It's no fault of Elvis, she said softly years later. He loved the song. That line, so calm, so forgiving, carried the ache of someone who had learned that kindness often requires heartbreak. She never blamed him, only the machinery that made compassion impossible. And when, decades later, Whitney Houston's version of the same song conquered the world, Dolly didn't gloat. She simply smiled and said, "That was God's way of showing me I did the right thing." But not every battle in Dolly's life was so cinematic. Some were quieter. Smaller wars fought in studios, between chords and egos. During the making of Trio with Linda Ronstadt and Emmylou Harris, Dolly faced another kind of conflict, the collision of three women, three perfectionists, and three very different ways of creating. Dolly was instinctive. She liked to record quickly, catching the first spark of emotion. Linda was the opposite, meticulous to the point of obsession, spending hours perfecting a single note. Emmylou often played the peacemaker, trying to keep the energy soft, the friendships intact. We loved each other, Dolly later said, but we also drove each other crazy. From the outside, the album sounded angelic, three voices blending like prayer. Inside the studio, it was a battlefield of ideals. And when Linda later described Dolly as unreliable and careless in interviews, Dolly didn't answer back. She stayed silent. That silence was her weapon. Then came 2008, the year Howard Stern turned that silence into cruelty. His team edited audio clips from Dolly's audiobook, stitching her real voice into fake sentences filled with vulgarity, racism, and self-degradation. It wasn't parody, it was a violation, a theft of the one thing Dolly valued most: her voice. For an artist whose life revolved around sound, it was a nightmare. She issued a rare public statement. I have never been so shocked, hurt, and humiliated in all my life. I cannot believe what Howard Stern has done to me. There was no shouting, no public outrage, just quiet disbelief and the sorrow of someone who had spent a lifetime building dignity, only to see it mocked. But 15 years later, in 2023, Dolly returned to the Howard Stern show. To many, it looked like forgiveness. It wasn't. It was reclamation. She went back to the scene of the wound not to make peace, but to prove that the wound no longer defined her. She smiled. She sang. She promoted her album, Rockstar, and without saying a word, she rewrote the story. For Dolly, victory was never about revenge. It was about ownership, the quiet power of telling your own truth when others try to tell it for you. Throughout her career, Dolly has lived at the intersection of opposites, kindness and exploitation, art and commerce, femininity and power. She has been underestimated for her looks, patronized for her accent, mocked for her optimism. And yet, she never stopped being herself. She was never the fragile Southern angel the media imagined. She was, and remains, a warrior who fights with grace, using humor as her sword and empathy as her shield. That's the hidden truth behind the glitter. Gentleness isn't a weakness you're born with. It's a discipline you earn, forged through humiliation, heartbreak, and the constant effort to stay human in a world that rewards cruelty. Dolly doesn't need to win arguments. She doesn't need to prove her worth. Her revenge is her peace. Each time she steps on stage, smiling under the bright lights, she is doing something profoundly subversive, reminding the world that power can look like kindness, that strength can sound like laughter, and that silence, when chosen, can be louder than rage. You don't have to shout to be heard. She once said, "You just have to know who you are." In an industry built on noise and competition, Dolly Parton chose the opposite path. She embraced stillness, humility, and forgiveness, not because she was naive, but because she knew they were the only ways to keep her soul intact. Her softness is her strategy. Her smile is her statement, and her life filled with betrayal, lawsuits, and misunderstandings remains the proof that gentleness, when disciplined by pain, can outlast everything else. Because in the end, while the world chases the spotlight, Dolly Parton shines brightest in the quiet, where the truth of her music still whispers, unbroken and her own. The greatest revelation in Dolly Parton's life is not a scandal, nor a secret. It is the quiet miracle of how she turned pain into gratitude. That is the real shock. Not for her audience, but for those who once underestimated her. In 2002, Dolly did something no one expected. She walked onto the stage of the Country Music Hall of Fame to personally induct Porter Wagoner, the very man who had once controlled her career, sued her, and broken her heart. Standing beneath the soft glow of the stage lights, she spoke with the same calm grace that had carried her through decades of storms. "If it hadn't been for Porter," she said, "I might never have become who I am today." No tears, no bitterness. Just a smile, the kind of smile born from someone who has suffered enough to understand that forgiveness is not weakness. It is mastery. The audience rose to their feet. They understood this was not forgetfulness, it was evolution. Dolly hadn't erased the past, she had rewritten its meaning. 5 years later, in 2007, when Porter was dying, Dolly visited him in the hospital. Shortly after, he passed away. She organized a private memorial concert at Dollywood, her own theme park. Not for publicity, not for cameras, but for a man who had been both her bridge and her barricade. After the ceremony, she quietly told a friend, I don't know if I was crying for him or for the part of my youth that died with him. That single sentence revealed everything about her. Every loss in her life had become a lesson in how to love without losing herself. Years later came another moment of reckoning, one that seemed ordinary but carried enormous symbolic weight. 15 years after the cruel hoax that had humiliated her, Dolly once again walked into Howard Stern's studio. The same place where her voice had once been twisted into vulgarity was now filled with reverence and restraint. She wasn't there for closure, she was there for sovereignty. When she sat down at the microphone, there was no trace of anger. She talked about her new album, Rockstar, about aging with joy, about learning from pain. Stern, the man once known for his arrogance, listened in respectful silence. Perhaps he, too, realized he was in the presence of a woman who no longer needed to be defended because she had already reclaimed everything that had been taken from her. At the end of the interview, Dolly smiled, stood up, and said, almost playfully, "You know, sometimes the best way to get even is to be kind." It wasn't a quip. It was a declaration, the ultimate act of control. Throughout her career, Dolly has been underestimated because of her looks, her accent, her humor, her softness. People mistook kindness for naivety. They saw the glitter, not the discipline. But the truth is, Dolly Parton has never been a victim of her image. She has been the architect of it. She knew how to turn perception into protection. The big hair, the laughter, the sparkle, all of it was theater. And she was both the writer and the star. She let the world believe she was easy to define, so that she could stay free to be herself. That is the biggest shock of all. The realization that the woman everyone thought they understood, the sweet Southern angel, was, in fact, the most self-aware, deliberate, and quietly powerful figure in American music. Forgiveness, to her, was not an act of mercy. It was a way of keeping power where it belonged inside her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't strike back. She simply kept showing up singing, creating, giving until the noise around her faded and only her truth remained. By her late 70s, Dolly Parton no longer cared about pleasing anyone. She had transcended the need to be adored. What she wanted, instead, was peace, the kind that comes from living without resentment, from outgrowing anger, from owning every version of herself. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate revelation, that the real victory is not in conquering others, but in staying whole. The world remembers her as the woman who smiled through betrayal, who said no to Elvis, who forgave Porter, who outlasted every insult and stereotype. But beneath all those headlines lies a more profound truth, that Dolly Parton managed to keep her heart intact in a world where most people lose their souls. In the end, Dolly Parton's story is not about fame, fortune, or even music. It is about the long, quiet art of keeping one's soul intact. She has been betrayed, underestimated, mocked, adored, and mythologized, and through it all, she has remained startlingly human. What makes her legend so enduring is not perfection, but balance, the harmony between gentleness and strength, laughter and sorrow, faith and self-preservation. When Whitney Houston's version of "I Will Always Love You" became one of the best-selling songs in history, the world finally caught up to what Dolly had always known, that integrity pays its own kind of royalty. That moment wasn't about money or fame. It was a confirmation that standing by one's principles can echo far louder than any applause. Throughout her life, Dolly has built an empire of songs, of stories, of kindness. She has given millions of books to children, raised money for hospitals, and written lyrics that remind people that poverty, pain, and love all sing in the same key. Yet behind that generosity is something even more profound: discipline. The discipline to remain open-hearted without being naive. The discipline to forgive without forgetting. That, perhaps, is the greatest moral of her life. That softness is a choice, and dignity is a decision. Her career has been a study in contrast, a woman wrapped in glitter who lived by scripture, a global superstar who still calls herself a mountain girl. For Dolly, humility isn't modesty, it's wisdom. It is knowing that everything fades except character, and that what you give away freely can never truly be taken from you. She once said, half in jest, "It costs a lot of money to look this cheap." But what she meant was something far deeper, that authenticity requires work, courage, and sacrifice. Today, at nearly 80, Dolly Parton no longer needs to prove anything. Her legacy isn't just in her songs, it's in the silence between them, in the strength of a woman who never stopped believing that kindness could outlast cruelty. And if there is a final question her life leaves us with, it might be this: in a world that rewards noise, can we still recognize the quiet power of a soul that refuses to be sold?